earlier this year, in June, the national think tank Demos came out with an affordability report, and I'm going to read a quote from that report, and it says, "Economic inequality is corrosive to democracy because people feel that policymakers are unresponsive to their needs, that their voices do not matter, and that it's hard to influence decisions that shape their lives." Fran, you earlier mentioned those closest to the pain are closest to the solution. That is a riff from Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy book. If you were governor, how would you make sure that underrepresented communities all across Wisconsin, multiracial, multi-ethnic, and rural communities have a voice at the table and are heard as equal and as much as folks in Madison or Milwaukee or larger population centers?
Income inequality is the crisis that we have to meet and solve, and it can only be solved by establishing a multiracial democracy. I've been fortunate to be able to travel, to have had the opportunity to travel across this state for the last 5 years. I was elected in 2020 to one of the most progressive districts in the state. And one of the first things I did when I was elected was get the hell out of Dane County. And I went to Platteville and Hudson. We visited De Pere. And what I realized was, folks, it's not just about having a seat at the table. To actually have a say, you gotta stop being the seat warmer and be able to influence power and hold power accountable. And that means having politicians who actually know that power has to answer to the folks in those most underrepresented areas. And what that looks like for me is that these communities know what they need. It's not about coming in and telling folks what they need, but making sure that the accessibility to state benefits that are actually these social insurance programs. I don't see things like food, housing, education, and healthcare as benefits, but as rights, as things that are needed in order to build economic security and freedom for yourself. I think it's important that, especially folks, that it is their government that comes to meet them, that beyond liaisons or ambassadors, that the accountability measures and metrics are agreed upon at the beginning, that we ensure that we're helping people build in their own lobby to essentially challenge industry lobby and folks who already have so much money and power in. And I think that's why we need not only a new type of politics, but somebody right now who isn't answering to industry and who isn't being pressured by status quo, but instead continues to make sure that politicians, in my view, should see themselves as public servants first. And that in order to build power for, and if you hold power, that you have a responsibility to share it. And what that looks like, I think, too, is going to depend on what the community demands it looks like. But the accessibility to resources is where I think we have to make fundamentally, whether it's technology changes, whether it's investing in more navigator programs, and making sure that beyond just knowing some of these resources exist at the state, that people are told how to actually use and access them.
Thanks, Fran. Mandela.
So when I would travel across the state early on, before the campaign, during my time as a legislator, when I get home, people say, what do you talk about when you get outside of Milwaukee? What do you talk about when you get outside of Madison? I tell them I talk about the same exact things that I talk about at home, because surprise, surprise, people just want a good school to send their children to. People want a good job that puts food on the table. People want to go to a doctor and not worry about a surprise bill. And that is a reality that has been consistently denied across the board, regardless of if you're in a city, if you're in a rural community, regardless of your race, regardless of your religion. Things have been difficult for a long time. And as we continue to have conversations about the affordability crisis, the reality is that this is nothing new. It is just spread to more areas where it wasn't exactly as prevalent as it is now. We see a lot of folks who've made it into higher income brackets all of a sudden see their livelihoods in jeopardy because of these large corporations that have always taken advantage of working class folks. Now this is starting to hit upper middle income brackets. Now this is starting to hit the white collar workforce. And now all of a sudden it is a problem. And I can tell you it sucks because the communities that have been saying this for the longest, who've been demanding more for the longest and have been consistently denied and ignored for the longest, have been feeling this pain for far too long. And that's one of the reasons why everything is so broken. That's one of the reasons why our politics is so broken, because voices aren't always heard. Voices aren't even allowed at the table. And I got my start as an organizer. I still see myself as an organizer, formerly doing interfaith social justice work. Building multiracial movements is a part of me, is the work that I have been up to throughout my entire time, my entire career. And so every time I've organized, anytime I've run for office, it has been about building that multiracial democracy, that multi-ethnic democracy, that democracy that brings about people from all points of life. Because I can't tell you how many rooms I've been in where we've been discussing a topic and I'll say, has anybody at this table ever been impacted by this issue? And sometimes that answer is no. And when that answer is no, the realization that you couldn't be farther from the solution comes about. And I say, well, it's time for us to disband. We need to bring people in this conversation who have something to actually do with it. And that doesn't happen unless you are building campaigns, whether you're building organizational infrastructure that considers, not just considers, but intentionally and deliberately brings those voices on board and not just listens, but actually puts those voices in the forefront. Lets people speak for themselves and speak to their own issues and their own challenges, because that's how we demand more. And that's actually how we fix things, when people get to speak for themselves and feel empowered to do so.
Thanks, Mandela. Kelda.
Part of the crisis in democracy is because people have learned that they can't rely on government, that it maybe doesn't matter, they think, who they vote for, because their life doesn't materially change. And that is by design. That is by design. Republicans have made it very difficult for government to solve problems, and they have made it engaged in voter suppression efforts to make it hard for us to have our voices heard. And this takes shape in everything from voter ID laws that go after the ability of young people and communities of color to vote at the same rates. It is gerrymandering laws where politicians are picking their voters and determining the outcome. It is the way that they have distorted our campaign finance laws to give the wealthiest and big corporations virtually the ability to buy our democracy. We have the best democracy money can buy, and that's like not that great of a democracy. So to solve these problems, there are actual policy interventions that we can put in place that will make it easier for people to have their voices heard, to have a true representative democracy. And of course, it's voting rights, it's public financing, and it's making sure that government is accountable and transparent. We can only get that if we have power. And how do you get power in an unfair system where it's a very, very difficult loop? But we have a once in a generation opportunity this year to elect a Democratic governor, a Democratic legislature who can make those changes. Can. It is not a guarantee. And as someone who was there the last time we had a Democratic trifecta, it was not a picnic. It was not, we got everything we wanted. Having a governor who knows what needs to be done, doesn't need to wait for a blue ribbon commission, doesn't need to go to like this to say, I don't know, should we end the private voucher program that's draining our public schools? No, of course we're going to do it. We need a governor who is willing and able to use power to make people's lives better. That is what we have been missing most of all in our politics. It is people who are willing to stand up and lead and use political power. See what Republicans do when they have power. They hurt people with it. They take away our rights. They trample our Constitution. They literally attack communities. We need Democrats who are willing and able to use power to help people and to build the true accountable democracy that all of us deserves. The best way to get people engaged in politics and in government is to actually make their lives better. It's to deliver for people. And that is the most important thing that we can do, not just to win this election, but to build long-term power in the state where people feel like, hey, it does matter. I can show up. I have a voice at the table. Listening is the first step, and it is the most important part. That's why Tammy Baldwin wins in rural areas again and again, even as a liberal lawyer, career politician from Madison. Step 2 is doing the thing that they told you they needed.